We're all paying more for food, and it's not only because of inflation. Data has shown that companies across the food industry might be raising prices more than they need to. Since the beginning of the COVID pandemic, Coles and Woolworths have grown their profit margins by around 2%. At the same time, shoppers are being hit with higher grocery bills, and supermarkets are walking away with a healthy bump to their revenue. Rod Sims, the former head of Australia's competition watchdog, said big supermarkets have likely used their market power to increase prices higher than necessary. The supermarkets claimed at a Senate inquiry early in the year that their price hikes were due to rising food input costs caused by the war in Ukraine and COVID-related supply issues. Except that's not the full picture. Both Ukraine and Russia are major suppliers of wheat and sunflower oil, which means Russia's invasion did result in a massive shock to global supply and sent food prices soaring to record levels in March 2022. But since then, the UN says food input prices have actually come down by 23%. And the OECD has noted that since that initial shock, caused by Russia's invasion, global food exports have held up relatively well. Now, the situation is still volatile. Russia has targeted Ukrainian grain exports again, but the prices are still significantly lower than what they were just after the invasion in March 2022. And the cost of fuel used to transport food around the world has also come down. So, we went back to Coles and Woolworths and asked them why their profits have increased while food input prices have actually come down. They said it's because of improved productivity and cost efficiencies. But whatever the cause, it's clear these savings are not being passed on to consumers. And it's not just supermarkets that are suspected of taking advantage of this crisis. Some food production companies have been reducing the size of their products, or what economists call shrinkflation, meaning consumers are paying more for literally less. Cottage jam has decreased by 25% in size, but only 7% was shaved off its price. Sunrise's mini bites have also had their size reduced by 25%, but the price has stayed the same. When we asked Sunrise why they were doing this, they blamed increased input costs, including well-documented energy price rises, even though both those costs have come down. We then asked Sunrise whether their mini bites would return to their original size, given both food input and energy costs have fallen, and we're yet to receive a reply. We sent a similar question to Kraft, the makers of cottage jam, and they also did not respond. Fast food chains are also hiking up prices. In the course of a year, KFC increased its prices by up to 25%, almost 5 times the inflation rate. Meanwhile, Mac has lifted their prices by an average of 8%. All of this matters because food is the second largest item in the Consumer Price Index, which is used to measure inflation. So if food companies and supermarkets are deliberately increasing prices above what's required to cover rising costs, then it impacts overall inflation. And even though inflation has passed its peak, food prices are still going up. Back in March, I looked into the impact of corporate profits on inflation. At the time, the Reserve Bank dismissed corporate profits as playing a role, insisting that demand was still the main driver of inflation.
Rising profits are not the source of the inflation pressures we have.
This is despite retail data showing that we're all actually spending less than we were a year ago. Now we're in a phase where inflation might be sticking, and a big reason for that, as noted by the OECD, are corporate profits. And the RBA has changed its tune, finally acknowledging in June that some firms were indexing their prices implicitly or directly to past inflation. There's no law prohibiting a company from increasing prices, and governments typically rely on a free competitive market to keep companies from profiteering. But what happens when there's very little competition? The OECD has pointed out that weaker competition contributes to corporate profits. And in Australia, Coles and Woolworths are basically a duopoly. The Albanese government said last year that we need more competitive markets to bring prices down. The government's not planning an intervention in supermarkets at this stage, but it does have options that it's not yet using. For example, in France, the government threatened the food industry with financial sanctions if companies didn't bring prices down on products where wholesale costs have fallen. The mere threat of sanctions was enough to get the French food industry to cooperate. And when I asked Assistant Minister Lee, what is your message to companies that are raising their prices higher than inflation, more than they need to increase their profit margins during a cost of living crisis?
Well, it's easier to have a message for consumers than for firms, because the power is in consumers' hands, and to shop around not only benefits your own wallet, but it also benefits other shoppers in the economy.
Except it's hard for consumers to shop around when there's so few options available. On that point at least, Andrew Lee agreed, saying he was concerned that companies were raising their prices. But it's not lost on most Australians that the government hasn't responded as effectively as it could on suspected profiteering, particularly in the food sector. It might also explain why, according to a recent Garden Essential poll, 3/4 of voters don't think the government's doing enough to address the cost of living crisis. Look, we all need to eat to live. We don't have the option to just not shop at the supermarket. And that's why there's such great emphasis on the government to act when it comes to food prices. So far, we're not seeing much of it. If you like this video, I also write a newsletter called The Afternoon Update. It's a quick 3-minute roundup of the news that matters. I've popped a link in the description, or you can just download the Guardian app and you'll get a notification every afternoon.